In the quiet places of the world, where human footsteps seldom fall and the air is touched by older magics, live beings whose names are rarely spoken aloud. Among them are the Knooks, guardians of the forest paths, watchers of the birds, friends to beasts and growing things. Their days pass in a gentle splendor. No hunger, no cold, no wearisome labor, only the delicate joy of using powers that mortals can hardly imagine. Yet even in immortality, boredom can creep like mist. This is the story of Popopo, a Knook who grew tired of endless perfection, meddled with the world of cities and fashions, and, in trying to correct his mistakes, enchanted the very letters out of which human thoughts are printed. Chapter 1. Popopo grows restless. For ages upon ages, so long that the growth of mountains might have been counted upon his fingers, Popopo had lived in the green realms where Knooks make their homes. There, sunlight filtered through leaves older than any kingdom, and brooks spoke in languages only immortals and stones understand. Popopo's dwelling, woven of roots and silver threads of spider silk, was a place of perfect tranquility. No wheels rattled, no doors slammed, no voices quarreled. Even the winds there knew how to whisper. Being a Knook meant possessing powers that would have made a human magician faint with envy. With the thought, Popopo could travel from one end of the earth to the other. A flicker of his will might coax a stubborn seed to sprout or turn a fierce storm aside from a field of nesting birds. If ever he desired something, a fruit not yet in season, a glimpse of a rare butterfly, a tune forgotten by time, he had only to wish, and it was his. For a long while, this seemed enough. He had danced in moonlight with fireflies, listened to the songs of whales in far oceans, and watched snowflakes form patterns too intricate for any mortal lace-maker. He had sat with the rills and fairies around their glowing rings, trading tales of the strange creatures called humans. But immortality, for all its gifts, stretches on without end. After so many centuries of satisfaction, Popopo discovered that even wonder can thin like old cloth. Each new delight reminded him of a dozen similar ones he had already tasted. The ease with which he could satisfy a whim began to rob each wish of its savor. One evening, as twilight deepened and owls took their posts among the branches, Popopo sat on a fallen log and sighed. "I have seen everything," he murmured. "I have done everything. I can shape the wind, speak to roots, and yet my heart sits as still as a stone. There must be somewhere a flavor of life that has not yet touched my tongue." He thought of the stories he had heard from wandering fairies, tales of shining cities filled with clattering machines and hurried people, of lights that mimicked the stars and streets that hummed day and night. These towns, as the mortals called them, seemed worlds apart from his own forest glades. Humans, it was said, moved through their days with a constant struggle for food, shelter, and the curious pieces of metal and paper they named money. To have so little power, Popopo mused, and yet to weave such noise and bustle. What must that be like? Perhaps their way of living holds a sort of excitement that my quiet life lacks. A stirring of curiosity replaced a little of his heaviness. The thought of watching these mortal folk, not from a distance, as he had sometimes done, but up close, walking their streets, warmed the slow current of his immortal blood. Very well, he decided. I shall visit a city. What harm can it do to look? Chapter 2. A City by Day. The next morning, After a breakfast so light and delicate that any human child would have complained of hunger, Popopo made ready. He wrapped around himself a cloak woven of mist, which rendered him invisible to mortal eyes. With a thought and a twist of his will, he stepped out of the forest and found himself in the very next heartbeat, standing in the middle of a great city. The assault upon his senses was immediate. Where his home had held the gentle murmur of leaves and streams, here a roar of sound crashed around him. Carriages rumbled, iron-shod wheels clanging upon stones. Wagons creaked under heavy loads. Voices shouted to be heard above the din. Street vendors cried their wares. Newsboys called headlines, and somewhere a dog barked furiously at nothing at all. Tall buildings rose on either side like cliffs of brick and stone. Windows flashed sunlight into his eyes. A thick smell of smoke and cooking meat and horses and hot metal rolled through the air. Everywhere he looked, humans hurried, men with hats pulled low, women lifting their skirts from the mud, children darting between steps. No one seemed at rest. Popopo's nerves, long accustomed to the soft, measured rhythms of the forest, shrank from the cacophony. His heart beat too quickly. The clatter of hooves struck his ears like blows. Even though no one could see him, he felt exposed, as if the frantic energy of the place would sweep him away. "This is too much," he gasped after only a few moments. No nook was meant for such storms of noise. Before the next wagon could rattle past, he retreated, folding himself through space back to the green calm of his own dwelling. The sudden silence there wrapped around him like a soothing cloak. "Well," he admitted to himself as birds resumed their gentle singing, "I have seen the city by day, and it is more than enough. Yet the taste of it lingers. Those mortals carry on their shoulders burdens I have never known, and still they rush about as though each moment matters greatly. There is something there I have not yet understood." For a time, the memory of the racket kept him content to remain at home. But immortality is long, and the flavor of new experience fades quickly when one has an eternity of hours to fill. Soon the old restlessness stirred again. He considered the city anew. The tumult of day was unbearable, he thought. But the fairies say that humans have a time each night when they lie motionless in their houses, their thoughts turned inward. If I visit the city while they sleep, perhaps I may examine it in peace. The buildings will remain, the shops full of strange goods, but the shouting and clattering will be still. The plan pleased him. He resolved to go again, this time under cover of darkness. Chapter 3. Nocturnal Wanderings. When night fell, deep and star-sown, Popopo wrapped himself once more in his cloak of invisibility and stepped from his forest doorway into the middle of the city. The difference was astonishing. The streets that had seethed with motion now lay mostly empty, washed in the pale light of scattered lamps. The great buildings towered still, but they seemed now like sleeping giants, their many-eyed windows dark. A cool wind slipped through the alleys, carrying only faint smells of smoke and stone. Here and there, a carriage rolled by with a sleepy clop of hooves, but for the most part, the roar of the day had dwindled to a murmur. Popopo's sensitive nerves relaxed. He drew a long breath and began to walk. Being a knook, locks presented no obstacle. He could step through a closed door as easily as through mist, and his eyes, trained in the dim undergrowth of ancient forests, saw clearly even in the thickest shadow. Curiosity led him from house to house. He drifted into parlors hung with framed pictures, kitchens where pots sat waiting for morning fires, bedrooms where children lay sprawled in dreams. He examined the curious contraptions of mortal life, stoves that breathed fire when fed with coal, lamps that burned without flickering, chairs and tables shaped to human bodies. He marveled at pantries lined with jars and tins, at closets full of garments for every sort of weather. The humans had so many objects, he thought, each serving some small need or whim. How much time they would spend making, buying, and caring for all these things. After a while, he wandered into the part of the city where shops lined the streets. This fascinated him most of all. In the forest, no creature hoarded piles of goods. Each took what it needed from the abundance around them. Here, however, were rooms overflowing with objects gathered from many places: bolts of fabric, shelves of books, rows of tools, glittering jewelry, baskets of fruit, and countless items whose uses he could only guess. What strange creatures mortals are, he mused. They gather more than they can use at once, arrange it attractively, and then spend their days persuading others to give them shiny tokens in exchange. Yet there is charm in the variety. Drawn by curiosity, he slipped into a narrow shop whose windows were filled with ribbons, feathers, and most intriguingly, women's hats. It was a millinery, a word he had heard but never fully understood. Inside, the air smelled faintly of glue and perfume. Against one wall stood a great glass case, within which rows of hats were displayed like flowers in a conservatory. Some were simple and modest, others rose in elaborate swirls of fabric and lace. What caught Popopo's attention, however, were the birds. Upon many of the hats perched small winged bodies, sparrows, finches, quail, and other species he recognized from his guardianship. Their feathers were glossy and bright, their eyes dark beads. Some sat as though in mid-song, bills slightly open, others spread wings as if just landing. Popopo's heart clenched. To his Knook's eyes, they looked imprisoned, captured by some cruel magic, and held motionless in a glass cage. He pressed a hand to the case, his thoughts racing. "Poor little friends," he whispered. "How did these mortals trap you so? You should be in the high branches, in the open air, not imprisoned upon circles of cloth." Being unacquainted with the human practice of stuffing birds, he did not realize that they were no longer alive. To him, every bird was a living creature under his protection. His first impulse was outrage. His second, rescue. With a wave of his hand, he slid the glass door aside. Then he pursed his lips and gave a small, trilling whistle, a sound every bird knew, the call of the Knooks. "Come, friends," he said softly. "The way is open. Fly out to the night." Had they been dead, of course, nothing would have happened. But the magic woven into Knook whistles reaches places where ordinary life and death do not fully rule. To Popopo's astonishment and secret satisfaction, each little bird stirred. Wings flexed, heads turned. In another heartbeat, the hats were empty. With a flutter and rustle like leaves in a sudden breeze, the birds shook themselves free of thread and glue, leaving tiny gaps where they had been attached. They flew about the shop in quick, excited circles, stretching wings that had been still for so long. "Poor dears," murmured Popopo, his heart warming. "You must long for the forests." He opened the outer door and stepped aside. "Off you go, then. Seek the fields and trees. Be glad and free again." They needed no second invitation. In a burst of color and song, they swept through the door into the cool night air, rising toward the dark sky with grateful chirps. Popopo watched them vanish, a deep contentment settling over him. He closed the shop door gently behind them and resumed his wandering, heart lighter than it had been in centuries. Chapter 4. A Milliner's Tears and a Knook's Mistake. Dawn painted the city's tallest windows with pale gold before Popopo grew weary of his explorations. Satisfied with the new sights he had gathered, he returned to his woodland home and slept through the brightening of the day. For some days afterward, the memory of the freed birds kept him pleased. "I have done a good deed," he told the whispering leaves. "Those poor creatures were imprisoned for the vanity of mortals. Now they are where they belong." Yet the itch of curiosity had not quite been satisfied. The night's wanderings had shown him the city at rest. He wondered what other changes might come if he visited again. So, when darkness fell once more, he wrapped himself in his misty cloak and stepped back into the city streets. As he passed the millinery shop, he noticed a glow of lamplight within. Surprised, for he assumed all would be asleep at this hour, he drifted silently through the door. Inside, he found two women. One sat at a table, her face buried in her arms, shoulders shaken with sobs. The other stood beside her, murmuring words meant to console. To mortal eyes, Popopo was invisible, but he could see them clearly, the lines of worry around their mouths, the way tiredness weighed on their limbs. He listened. "Do not despair," the standing woman was saying gently. "The hats themselves remain. Perhaps we can trim them anew." The one with her head on the table lifted a tear-streaked face. She was the milliner, the owner of the shop, and grief had reddened her eyes. "You do not understand," she cried. "The fashion is for birds. No woman will buy a hat without one. The ribbons and laces alone are not enough. All my savings went into those birds, and now they are gone, stolen in the night. If I cannot sell these hats, I will be ruined. I shall not be able to pay the rent nor buy bread." She dropped her head again and sobbed. A slow, uncomfortable heat spread through Popopo's chest. He saw now what he had not considered before, that the birds, once shot and purchased, had become part of this woman's livelihood. Their absence meant not only empty hats, but empty cupboards. "I have done this," he thought, shame pricking him. "In rescuing my feathered friends, I have wounded one of the very mortals I wish to observe. I have turned her work into useless cloth." The consoling sister spoke again, but her words did little to calm the milliner's despair. Popopo could bear no more. He slipped out into the street, the echo of the woman's sobs following him like a trail of smoke. Back in his forest home, he paced beneath the trees. Immortals seldom have cause to reckon with unintended consequences. Their whims rarely touch the fragile web of human lives. Now Popopo had seen for the first time how a single act done in kindness could ripple outward and cause suffering. "I must mend this," he told himself. "Surely there is some way." After long thought, a notion came to him. Birds, he knew, were beloved by knooks and by the air itself, but mice, those small gray nibblers of crumbs and walls, enjoyed no such protection. They lived in shadowed corners of human houses, stealing grain and cheese. Humans, he had noticed, did not treasure them. Yet they are soft-furred and graceful in their own way, he mused. Their bodies are small and could perch upon hats as well as birds. If I placed mice upon the milliner's hats in place of the birds, her wares would be whole again. The mice would be removed from a life of petty thievery and set upon a more respectable path. It will be a kindness all around." So reasoning, he returned to the city in the dark hours before dawn, and sought beneath the streets for a place where mice lived in abundance. It did not take long. In a nearby cellar, he found a thriving colony, tiny gray bodies slipping through cracks, whiskers twitching, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Here are the very creatures I need," Popopo said with satisfaction. "Come, little ones." With a gesture and a murmured charm, he gathered them, a flowing tide of gray, lifting them by magic and carrying them through the air to the millinery shop. One by one he placed them upon the hats inside the glass case, arranging them where the birds had once sat. Their fur made soft shadows against the silk and lace. To keep them from scampering away, he whispered another spell, rendering them motionless. They froze in place, small paws extended, tails curling artistically. To Popopo's eyes, the effect was charming. Almost as pretty as birds, he thought, and their morals will surely improve in such company. Pleased with his solution, he decided to remain and witness the milliner's delight when she discovered her restored stock. He settled himself in a corner, invisible and patient. Soon the gray light of morning crept into the sky. The milliner and her sister arrived, their faces still marked by the sorrow of the previous night. They unlocked the door, swept and dusted in a mechanical way, and at last approached the glass case. The milliner opened it and lifted out the first hat. For a heartbeat, she stared at the small gray form nestled among the ribbons. Then her eyes widened, and a piercing shriek tore from her throat. She dropped the hat and sprang onto the nearest table with a single bound, skirts swishing. "A mouse!" she gasped, trembling. Her sister, startled by the cry, leapt onto a chair and clutched her skirts. "Where? What is it?" she cried. "There, in the case," the milliner panted. "A mouse upon my hat." Only then did Popopo realize his error. To humans, it seemed mice were creatures of dread and disgust. Where a bird might be admired, a mouse was cause for panic. And there, motionless upon every hat in the case, sat dozens of the little animals. He could not bear to see the women so terrified. With a quick, silent whistle, a sound only mice could hear, he released them from the spell and summoned them back. At once they sprang to life, leaping from hats, scurrying over the glass, and racing for the nearest crack. The sudden rush of gray bodies proved too much for the milliner and her sister. With fresh screams, they toppled backward, fainting dead away upon the shop floor. Popopo stood in stricken silence. In attempting to repair his first mistake, he had made matters worse. His kind heart ached with distress, unable to help them further. Knooks are not skilled in reviving fainted humans. He fled back to his own realm, carrying with him a heavy burden of responsibility. Chapter 5. Council of the Knook King. For days, Popopo wandered his forest in troubled thought. The birds, he knew, were free and joyful. The milliner, however, was left with a shopful of damaged hats, an empty case where her birds had been, and memories of mice that would no doubt haunt her dreams. "I cannot undo the shooting and stuffing that brought those birds to her shop," he reflected, "nor can I change the hearts of all hunters. Yet I have played a part in her misfortune. It is not enough to feel sorry, I must find a remedy." At last, acknowledging that his own ideas had led to disaster, he decided to seek wisdom beyond himself. He traveled to the hidden hall of the Knook King, a place deep beneath the roots of an ancient oak, where the walls were lined with glowing stones and the ceiling dripped with luminous moss. The king of the Knooks sat upon a throne carved from a single piece of petrified wood, his beard flowing like a waterfall. His eyes were as old as winter and as keen as a hawk's. Popopo bowed low and recounted the whole affair. His visit to the city, the release of the birds, the milliner's despair, the experiment with the mice, and the unfortunate fainting which had followed. When he finished, the king frowned, lines deepening across his brow. "This, Popopo," he said gravely, "should teach you the danger of meddling with mortals. Their lives are woven from threads of need and custom that we do not fully grasp. What seems kindness from our side may look like calamity from theirs." Popopo lowered his head. "I see that now, Majesty. Yet the deed is done. Is there no way to set matters right?" The king considered. "There are two groups whose welfare concerns us: the birds, who are under our protection, and the human woman, who, though mortal, has suffered because of your act. The birds must not return to slavery upon hats. That much is clear. Yet we cannot leave the milliner to ruin if there is a way to prevent it. Tell me, why do humans place birds upon their headgear in the first place?" "Because it is the fashion," Popopo replied. "Without them, the women think their hats incomplete and will not buy." "Then the root of the trouble lies not in the birds or the woman herself, but in this thing called fashion," the king said. "Fashions among mortals are like the wind in spring, always shifting. Today it is birds, tomorrow it may be something else entirely. They shape their garments not according to reason, but according to what is whispered in their ears by those who claim to know. If we can change the fashion, we may save both the birds and the milliner." Popopo's eyes brightened slightly. "Change the fashion? But how can we do that? The humans seem to obey some invisible rule written in the air." "The rule is written not in the air, but in their printed papers," the king explained. "In their cities, humans produce pages filled with small black marks they call types. These marks form words, and the words tell the people what is new, what is proper, what is to be admired or scorned. If the types declare that it is no longer stylish to wear birds upon hats, the mortals will soon cast aside the practice and seek other trimmings. You, Popopo, must go and enchant the types." "Enchant the types?" he repeated, feeling both relief and awe. "I had not thought of such a thing." "Few do," the king said with a hint of pride. "Travel to every newspaper and magazine office in the cities you visited. Bend the minds of the editors, or twist the types themselves, so that when women read of fashion, they will be told to wear ribbons and lace instead of birds. In this way the milliner may adorn her hats without cruelty, and our feathered subjects will remain free." Popopo bowed deeply. "Your wisdom shines brighter than any jewel, Majesty. I will do as you command." Chapter 6. Enchanting the Printed Word. Armed with this new purpose, Popopo felt the heaviness in his heart lift a little. He returned once more to the world of cities, not as a wandering observer this time, but as an emissary carrying a specific mission. Newspaper offices were unlike any places he had yet explored. They were filled with the scratch of pens, the clacking of typesetting machines, the smell of ink and paper. Men in ink-stained shirts hurried from desk to desk, while others fed pages into great iron presses that shook the floors as they turned. Moving invisibly among them, Popopo marveled at how much effort humans expended to spread words. No wonder they are so strongly guided by these printed marks, he thought. They pour hours of their brief lives into arranging them. In some offices, he approached the trays of metal letters, the types themselves. With a whispered charm and a touch, he caused them to rearrange whenever used for fashion columns. Sentences that had been laid out to praise hats heavy with birds now shifted. When the printing press struck ink onto paper, the words came out quite differently. "No lady of discernment," they read, "will now adorn her hat with dead birds, for the newest style demands only ribbons, lace, and other gentle trimmings." In other places, where the type was too complicated to meddle with directly, Popopo turned his attention to the editors. These men sat at cluttered desks, reading proofs and scribbling instructions. He breathed softly into their ears, filling their minds with a vague unease about feathered adornments and a sudden enthusiasm for simpler hats. One editor, midway through writing a glowing piece about the latest bird-laden creations from Paris, paused, frowned, and crossed out half his sentences. When he began again, he found himself praising the elegance of hats trimmed with silk bows and delicate folds of fabric instead. "Odd," he muttered, "but it does sound more refined." Another, who had planned to publish an advertisement encouraging ladies to add more birds to their wardrobes, instead wrote, "We are pleased to inform our readers that the most advanced circles have now renounced the wearing of stuffed birds. The truly fashionable woman would not be seen with such ornaments upon her head." Popopo moved from city to city, from magazines that spoke to distant towns, to newspapers that fluttered on street corners by morning. Everywhere he went, he left behind enchanted lines of print and editors whose dreams that night were filled with images of birds flying free. Humans, who often trust the written word more than their own thoughts, responded swiftly. When the next day's papers spread across breakfast tables, milliners and their customers alike read the same message. Birds were out of fashion. Hats should now be trimmed only with lace, ribbons, perhaps silk flowers, but never again with the bodies of small creatures. Some women felt a twinge of regret as they touched the feathered trophies on their existing hats, but the fear of appearing old-fashioned burned hotter than their attachment. "I cannot wear this again," they told one another. "It would be ridiculous." Orders began to change. Milliners who had boxes full of unused ribbons felt a surge of hope. Those whose shelves were lined with stuffed birds frowned, but merchants soon found other uses for the abandoned ornaments. Some were sold as curiosities, others collected dust in forgotten drawers. And in the fields and forests, saved from future slaughter, the living birds sang. Chapter 7. The milliner reads the news. Popopo, having sown the seeds of change, returned at last to the city where the story had begun. Before dawn, he slipped into the familiar millinery shop and perched unseen upon a shelf. The hats still bore the scars of his earlier interventions, small torn places where birds had been removed, faint traces of where mice had nervously rested. The bell over the door jingled as the milliner arrived, her shoulders bowed, but her chin set with weary determination. Her sister followed, carrying a basket of bread. They lit the lamps, swept the floor, and tended to their tasks with mechanical motions. On the counter lay a folded morning newspaper. As she passed, the milliner caught sight of a headline in the fashion column and, more from habit than hope, picked it up. Her eyes moved along the lines. At first, they barely seemed to take in the words. Then they widened. She read again, more slowly. The paper stated firmly that the latest style, straight from the most admired circles, now forbade the wearing of birds upon hats. Instead, it praised the delicacy of lace, the charm of ribbons arranged in artistic bows, the tasteful use of silk flowers. Ladies who continued to display stuffed birds, it warned, risked appearing cruel and behind the times. A flush rose to the milliner's cheeks. "Sister," she cried, "listen to this." She read the passage aloud, voice trembling. Her sister's eyes shone. "Then your hats, those trimmed with lace and ribbon alone, are suddenly in the height of fashion," she exclaimed, "and all those who have birds will come seeking you to alter them." The milliner looked around her shop as though seeing it anew. The hats she had considered ruined now appeared full of possibility. With nimble fingers, she began to adjust a nearby creation, adding a loop of velvet here, a fall of lace there. The design sprang to life under her touch. "Perhaps I am not ruined after all," she whispered. "Perhaps this change will be our salvation." In his hidden corner, Popopo felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The burden that had weighed on him since he first freed the birds eased at last. He had not undone his initial mistake. Nothing can erase an action once taken, but he had guided events toward a gentler outcome. The milliner would adapt and thrive. The birds would remain in the trees where they belonged. He slipped away as the first customers arrived, chattering excitedly about the new fashion they had read in their morning papers. Each hat they tried on, free of tiny, lifeless bodies, seemed lighter upon their heads. Chapter 8. A World Without Birds on Hats. In the weeks that followed, the change spread like sunrise. From one city to another, women folded up hats adorned with stuffed birds and laid them aside. Milliners, ever alert to shifts in taste, began to design new styles. Ribbons cascaded in graceful arcs. Lace fluttered like froth. Artificial flowers bloomed in every shade of silk. Some grumbled at first. A few hunters, who had made a tidy profit, supplying birds to the trade, cursed the newspapers and wondered why their shots now seemed always to miss. For when they raised their guns toward a sparrow or thrush, the bird often remained unharmed, the bullet passing harmlessly through a body already filled with cotton or straw. Mystified, they returned to their cabins empty-handed. Others, however, scarcely noticed the deeper cause of the change. Editors told themselves they had merely followed their instincts. Readers assumed that clever designers had grown tired of feathered ornaments. No one suspected that a knook had slipped through their offices, rearranging types and nudging thoughts. Popopo continued to visit millinery shops from time to time. In each he found and freed stuffed birds now considered worthless, restoring them to a curious half-life that allowed them to fly and sing once more. They departed with cries of gratitude, promising to stay far from the guns of men. The knook also watched the cities with more understanding. He saw the way a single idea, printed in thousands of copies, could turn habits upside down. He realized that mortal lives, though brief, were rich with change. Their very lack of immortality drove them to try new things, to build, to destroy, to invent. For himself, he felt a calmer contentment. The episode had taught him that power without wisdom could harm those one meant to help. Knowledge of both sides, the immortal and the mortal, was needed to act kindly. Closing reflection of fashion, words, and responsibility. Thus it came to pass that the fashion of wearing birds upon hats faded from the world, not because humans suddenly grew kinder of their own accord, but because a restless knook, the weeping of a milliner, and the quiet authority of a knook king all converged upon the tiny black marks that humans trust so deeply. Popopo's story is not merely a tale of enchanted types and talking birds. It is also a lesson in how small acts, whether wise or foolish, can ripple outward through lives we do not see. His first impulse, to free the birds, sprang from compassion, yet it ignored the invisible threads binding those birds to a woman's livelihood. His second idea, involving the mice, tried to mend the first mistake, but succeeded only in multiplying fear. Only when he sought counsel, admitting that his understanding was incomplete, did he find a path that honored both the creatures under his protection and the mortal whose hands had arranged them. Changing the printed word proved more powerful than any single act of rescue. By altering what people believed to be proper, he reshaped their behavior without a single command. In our own world, fashions still rise and fall, carried on the tide of words and images. People dress, speak, and even think according to ideas they have absorbed from pages and screens. Popopo's enchantment reminds us that behind every fashion, whether kind or cruel, there may be unseen influences. Yet it also suggests that change is possible. A thought written differently, a story told another way, can free more than birds. It can release hearts from habits that no longer deserve their loyalty. So, when you see a bird flash across the sky, untouched by shot or needle, consider that somewhere a knook may be smiling, and that somewhere too a typesetter or writer once put down words that turned vanity toward gentler paths. And remember that in every choice, what we praise, what we purchase, what we wear, we enchant the world a little ourselves, for good or ill. For more stories that can help you relax, don't forget to like and subscribe.